Hi, this is Jessica, the manager at the Trome Memorial Library, and I will be continuing the reading of Aesop's Fables from Aesop for Children, the 1919 edition, illustrations by Milo Winter. And I'm going to start today with the story, The Fighting Bulls and the Frog. Two bulls were fighting furiously in a field, at one side of which was a marsh. An old frog living in the marsh trembled as he watched the fierce battle. "What are you afraid of?" asked a young frog. "Do you not see," replied the old frog, "that the bull who is beaten will be driven away from the good forage up there to the reeds of this marsh, and we shall all be trampled into the mud?" It turned out as the frog had said. The beaten bull was driven to the marsh, where his great hoofs crushed the frogs to death. And the moral of this story: when the great fall out, the weak must suffer for it. The Mouse and the Weasel. A little hungry mouse found his way one day into a basket of corn. He had to squeeze himself a good deal to get through the narrow opening between the strips of the basket. But the corn was tempting, and the mouse was determined to get in. When at last he had succeeded, he gorged himself to bursting. Indeed, he became about 3 times as big around the middle as he was when he went in. At last he felt satisfied and dragged himself to the opening to get out again. But the best he could do was to get his head out. So there he sat, groaning and moaning, both from the discomfort inside him and his anxiety to escape from the basket. Just then a weasel came by. He understood the situation quickly. "My friend," he said, "I know what you've been doing. You've been stuffing. That's what you get. You will have to stay there till you feel like you did when you went in. Good night, and good enough for you." And that was all the sympathy the poor mouse got. Moral of the story: greediness leads to misfortune. The Farmer and the Snake. A farmer walked through his field one cold winter morning. On the ground lay a snake, stiff and frozen with the cold. The farmer knew how deadly the snake could be, and yet he picked it up and put it in his bosom to warm it back to life. The snake soon revived, and when it had enough strength, bit the man who had been so kind to it. The bite was deadly, and the farmer felt that he must die. As he drew his last breath, he said to those standing around, "Learn from my fate not to take pity on a scoundrel." The Sick Stag. A stag had fallen sick. He had just strength enough to gather some food and find a quiet clearing in the woods, where he lay down to wait until his strength should return. The animals heard about the stag's illness and came to ask after his health. Of course, they were all hungry and helped themselves freely to the stag's food, and as you would expect, the stag soon starved to death. The moral of the story: goodwill is worth nothing unless it is accompanied by good acts. The Goat Herd and the Wild Goats. One cold, stormy day, a goat herd drove his goats for shelter into a cave where a number of wild goats had also found their way. The shepherd wanted to make the wild goats part of his flock, so he fed them well, but to his own flock he gave only just enough to keep them alive. When the weather cleared and the shepherd let the goats out to feed, the wild goats scampered off to the hills. "Is that the thanks I get for feeding you and treating you so well?" complained the shepherd. "Do not expect us to join your flock," replied one of the wild goats. "We know how you would treat us later on if some strangers should come, as we did." The moral of the story: it is unwise to treat old friends badly for the sake of new ones. The Spendthrift and the Swallow. A young fellow who was very popular among his boon companions as a good spender quickly wasted his fortune trying to live up to his reputation. Then one fine day in early spring he found himself with not a penny left, and no property save the clothes he wore. He was to meet some jolly young men that morning, and he was at his wits' end how to get enough money to keep up appearances. Just then a swallow flew by, twittering merrily, and the young man, thinking summer had come, hastened off to a clothes dealer, to whom he sold all the clothes he wore down to his very tunic. A few days later, a change in weather brought a severe frost, and the poor swallow and that foolish young man in his light tunic, and with his arms and knees bare, could scarcely keep life in their shivering bodies. Moral of the story: one swallow does not make a summer. The cat and the birds. A cat was growing very thin. As you have guessed, he did not get enough to eat. One day he heard that some birds in the neighborhood were ailing and needed a doctor. So he put on a pair of spectacles and, with a leather box in his hand, knocked at the door of the birds' home. The birds peeped out, and Dr. Cat, with much solicitude, asked how they were. He would be very happy to give them some medicine. "Tweet, tweet," laughed the birds. "Very smart, aren't you? We are very well, thank you, and more so if you only keep away from here." Moral of the story: be wise and shun the quack. The dog and the oyster. There was once a dog who was very fond of eggs. He visited the hen house very often, and at last got so greedy that he would swallow the eggs whole. One day the dog wandered down to the seashore. There he spied an oyster. In a twinkling the oyster was resting in the dog's stomach, shell and all. It pained the dog a good deal, as you can guess. "I've learned that all round things are not eggs," he said, groaning. The moral: act in haste and repent at leisure, and often in pain. And the last story for this reading: the astrologer. A man who lived a long time ago believed that he could read the future in the stars. He called himself an astrologer and spent his time at night gazing at the sky. One evening he was walking along the open road outside the village. His eyes were fixed on the stars. He thought he saw there that the end of the world was at hand, when all at once down he went into a hole full of mud and water. There he stood up to his ears in the muddy water, and madly clawing at the slippery sides of the hole in his effort to climb out. His cries for help soon brought the villagers running. As they pulled him out of the mud, one of them said, "You pretend to read the future in the stars, and yet you fail to see what is at your feet. This may teach you to pay more attention to what is right in front of you and let the future take care of itself." "What use is it," said another, "to read the stars when you can't see what's right here on the earth?" And the moral of the story: take care of the little things, and the big things will take care of themselves.